This video was made possible through the support of my patrons.
Exterminate.
For almost 60 years, Doctor Who has been on the air, and just as synonymous with the lead character and their iconic time travel machine are their long-running and ever-persistent foes, the Daleks. Now that Revolution of the Daleks has broadcast, I think it's time I revisited the ranking list I did at the end of 2019 and find out just where that brand new story can be placed. Now, for the sake of brevity and my sanity, I am going to do a ranking, try and justify its placement, and then move on. If you want my in-depth thoughts on each of these stories, these 25 stories, then I highly recommend going through my Dalekcember 2019 videos, as this one is mainly just to touch base. There's a playlist in the description below if you want to check those out. Now, before we begin, I've got a lot more big projects lined up in the near future, so if you want to keep updated with all of that, then please consider hitting subscribe, hitting that like button for more Doctor Who content. Now, without any further ado, let's go from the irradiated planet Skaro to their final end, from allegiances with the Master and the Ogrons to their very genesis, from space plagues to mortuaries, the Time War and beyond. This is every televised Dalek story ranked worst to best.
So, anyone for Dodgems?
I know during my Dalekcember ranking I said that this tied with Asylum of the Daleks, but on the day I'm writing this, I feel like I've got to give the bottom spot to this astonishingly misjudged Series 9 opener, with an opening part that meanders, goes nowhere, and does so in the most alienating way possible before leading into a second episode with some really strong performances and great scenes, which are let down by an ending which shows that neither the 12th Doctor or Davros meant a word of what they were saying. Couple that with fan service Daleks on Skaro, a very selective memory on what actually happened in Genesis of the Daleks, and the revelation that apparently the Dalek mutants aren't in control, but it's the casing that does all of the hating, and it makes me wonder whether or not the creative team had even watched a single Dalek story before a single line of dialogue was written. Boring, confusing, obnoxiously presented, and a half-hour story spread across 2 episodes. I remember watching this on broadcast with my fiancé and a friend who hadn't watched Doctor Who for a few years but was a fan, and feeling utterly embarrassed to be a fan of the show. It is intensely fitting that the final MacGuffin that puts an end to Davros and the Daleks in the story is a massive uprising of shit.
Don't think that saved your life.
The main thing saving this story from being at the bottom spot is twofold. Firstly, it's only 1 episode, it's only half the length, and secondly, there are a few decent Dalek moments to be found here, though they take place with a setting and in a story that isn't structured to utilise them effectively. Whether it's an obnoxious Oswin, the return of Amy and Rory despite Series 6 giving them a satisfying departure, but finding them now divorced off-screen for the dumbest of reasons, and a promotional campaign that promised Dalek fan service but not remotely delivering. Asylum of the Daleks stands as the absolute low point of the 11th Doctor's tenure. Its biggest lasting legacy, however, is that it ended in a way that wiped the Daleks' memory of the Doctor, despite the only interesting idea this episode had being that the Pepperpots had grown stronger in response to the Doctor, essentially undermining its own premise for no good reason. However, this new status quo was just thrown in the bin the next time the Doctor met them in his timeline, and that's where Asylum of the Daleks belongs. In the bin.
Seek, locate, exterminate.
The infamous exploding jelly baby story. I'd have loved to see what the original Terry Nation script for this 4-part serial was before Douglas Adams got his hands on it, because while his trademark wit and humour is on display when writing for Tom Baker's 4th Doctor, it really serves to undermine the show's most iconic and ruthless villains in what was their first appearance in almost 5 years. The plot itself isn't too bad, and giving the Daleks a robotic threat to fight is a proven format to work, but turning the Daleks themselves into purely logical robots who are now reliant on Davros was the beginning of the end of their dominance in the classic series. It could be forgiven if Davros was a threatening presence, but David Goodison never stood a chance with that recycled mask, and his dialogue is as generic as it can get. Couple that with a slashed budget and a production coming apart at the seams, and this story, appropriately, was destined for disaster.
Don't be lasagna.
Okay, we've gone past the Dalek stories, which I think are no good, and now we're at the ones where I feel absolutely nothing when watching them. Into the Dalek is an ideal summation of Series 8 as a whole. A decent idea, but in execution it's a meandering, missed opportunity that's not remotely as smart as it likes to think it is. Oh, and Clara slaps the Doctor, because it's funny when it happens to men, am I right? The concept of doing a Fantastic Voyage homage, but inside a hostile Dalek casing, is a great one, and I do think that Ben Wheatley's direction makes this one of the greatest looking Dalek stories ever broadcast. I mean, look at these shots, they're absolutely stunning. But in the end, we just have stock characters, wasted actors like Michael Smiley and Zor Ashton, and an ending that's just a hollow and weaker retread of 2005's Dalek. Not much more to say about this, to be honest.
You know, for a man who abhors violence, I must say I took great satisfaction in doing that.
After making a genuinely surprising appearance alongside the Master after the slog of a 6-parter that was Frontier in Space, the Daleks make their proper Season 10 appearance in Planet of the Daleks, which is... it's alright, I guess. Jon Pertwee's Doctor is the standout here, and the early 1970s invisibility effects are actually pretty good, but for the show's 10th anniversary year, it's hard to view this as anything other than a weaker, in-colour remake of the 1963 original Dalek serial. It's not a bad story, but it's cast too paper thin to carry a 6-parter. The invisible Dalek threat is hinted at, but it never pays off, and the Daleks themselves are flatly characterised, with the exception of the Golden Supreme, who has absolutely no chill. I wouldn't steer fans away from this story, but there's way better classic era ones to watch.
I am your soldier.
I have very few issues with the opening 15 minutes of Victory of the Daleks. Winston Churchill in the World War II cabinet bases, the introduction of the Ironside soldiers invented by Edwin Bracewell, and the sense of tension and escalation as the Doctor and Amy try and find out what they're really plotting. Yeah, it's a fast-motion remake of Power of the Daleks, but it was a great change of pace after Journey's End. Then the Doctor gives his testimony, and then the wheels come flying off, as the Daleks have an immeasurably complicated plan to activate a progenitor which births a multicoloured race of new Daleks. The designs in and of themselves aren't really an issue, but with a design change this radical, they needed a story to showcase their strengths, but instead they're flown circles around by World War II Spitfires, they just hang around on a soundstage for half an hour yelling at the Doctor, and the Supreme can't even hit a moving target. As a standalone story, it's okay, but as a showcase for a new Dalek design, it's not fit for purpose, and I think that's why the production team immediately caved to fan backlash and brought the original designs back, which I think is a shame. If only this story had given the progenitors something to do, the past 10 years of Dalek stories could have been very different. This is a pretty hollow victory.
There is only one form of life that matters. Dalek life.
Controversial pick number 1 of this ranking, as I think this is the most overrated televised Dalek story. But understand that overrated doesn't inherently mean it's all bad, as there's a lot of good stuff in this second Doctor story, which initially follows the Doctor and Jamie searching for their stolen TARDIS, which becomes part of an immensely elaborate plot by the Daleks to make Jamie fight a Turkish wrestler so they can better learn about humanity's weaknesses, and no, that wasn't a joke. At 7 parts, it's way too long, with a meandering plot, but really strong characterization and moral core with characters like Maxtable and Waterfield. Also, while the Dalek plot is overly complicated and they're defeated in the end way too easily, David Whittaker always had a knack for writing the Daleks, and I love how they're depicted here, though the Emperor, while grand and iconic, really does just stand around booming orders. I'm glad this story wasn't the final end for the Daleks as originally planned, because it would have been a low point for them, in my opinion. Maybe if this story gets restored and animated, I'll warm to it a bit more, but as of right now, it stays towards the bottom half of this list.
What do you mean, creatures?
Oh, controversial pick number 2. I think this is the most underrated televised Dalek story. But much like the last pick, underrated doesn't necessarily mean it's all good, as things like the bad accents, a poorly thought out ending, and random pig slaves have given this story a bad reputation, and I can't really blame it. But part of me still admires it for its strong foundations at Hooverville, the fact that this explores concepts like the human factor better than evil of the Daleks, and how Dalek Sec is one of the more interesting villains of this era. I also can't get too mad at a story which stops partway through for a 1930s vaudeville dance number. It doesn't stick the landing all the way, but if there was any story that was going to go big or go home, it would be a story set in the Big Apple.
The devil in me.
Advance and attack. Attack and destroy. Destroy and rejoice.
The Chase is a story that needs to be approached with a very specific mindset. As the third Dalek story, it arrived during the peak of Dalek mania. The Daleks were bigger than Jesus, so to appeal to a wider audience and to maybe tone down all the, genocide and bleakness of their first outings, writer Terry Nation and script editor Dennis Spooner approached this story as a comedy. And when viewed through that specific lens, it's really good. Fans immersed in the revived series may know the Daleks as a source of death and destruction and misery, but if you go from that to The Chase, you'll be greeted to an epic encounter between the Daleks, Dracula, and Frankenstein's monster, as well as the Daleks having the trippiest, most kaleidoscopic fight scene you'll ever see. All you kids out there with your London 1965 memes, but what about Fred the Dalek, who got tricked down into a sandpit and found the encounter so traumatizing that Fred spent the rest of his life in intensive care at the Dalek Asylum? That's canon. Oh boy. But yeah, this is a fun one. Rest in peace, Fred the Dalek.
Target model destroyed.
I swear, I didn't mean to pair up stories like this, it's just how the list panned out, but here's another fun one. Though unlike The Chase, I have no idea if Death to the Daleks is intentionally funny. This is campy 70s Doctor Who at its most interesting, where Terry Nation, urged on by the showrunners at the time to experiment with the Daleks, decided to land them on a planet where they couldn't use their weapons and are forced to become part of the supporting cast. I wish that was taken a bit further and we we spent more time with that dynamic, but the rest of the serial is no slouch either, with fun creatures and monsters giving the Daleks grief, some cool concepts and visuals, and we obviously cannot forget about Bel-Al.
Which path did he take?
That one.
That way leads to death.
Episode 1 is a bit slow, but once the Daleks get introduced, this story is deliriously entertaining and off-kilter. It almost made me want to put it higher, but like I said, I'm not sure if these elements were deliberate, and this is of course that story with the—
Stop, don't move.
Who knows? I may have helped to exterminate you.
Death to the Daleks is my favourite of the Pertwee Dalek trilogy, but Day of the Daleks is the best, with the most interesting time travel plot, a decent supporting cast with the Candyman himself, Aubrey Woods, as a villain who is absolutely in a different story to everyone else, but I love him all the same, with timely and interesting political subtext about terrorism, freedom fighting, and the potential outcomes from otherwise good intentions. Day of the Daleks spins an intriguing yarn, even if the world building feels a bit underdeveloped in this alternative future being controlled by the Daleks, who might qualify as the weakest thing about this story. Their voices are boring and terrible, yes.
All enemies of the Daleks must be destroyed.
But even putting that aside, they're a bit bland here, and there's only 3 of them. It's a shame that this is their first televised colour appearance, as well as their first outing since their initial final end 5 years previous. Still though, the story itself cements its place above its relevant competition, and oh, the Ogrons are here. What's your report?
We found and destroyed the enemy.
Any complications?
No complications.
Daleks, be warned. You have declared war upon the Cybermen. This is not war. This is pest control.
Okay, this selection is pretty complicated, because while the Daleks made their splash halfway through the Series 2 two-part finale, it was a splash that made tidal waves that swallowed up everything around them, including the poor mistreated Cybermen who never stood a chance when being penned by Russell T Davies, who is clearly playing favourites. The Daleks even forced the split of the 10th Doctor and Rose to the resounding cheers of the audience. Doomsday introduces us to the cult of Skaro, led by Dalek Sec, and it was a great way to continue the trend of the revived series by giving us honest-to-God characters inside of these metal tanks. These are Daleks with bite and a bad attitude, with their gall to hijack another species' invasion plans. Their time in the spotlight was brief, but the cult of Skaro burnt furiously brightly, which might explain their roasting skills.
You are superior in only one respect.
What is that?
You are better at dying.
This is Mark Coy, Special Security Service reporting from the planet Kemble. The Daleks are planning the complete destruction of our galaxy.
Yes, it's a cliche to point it out, but 12 episodes for a story is way too long, and that doesn't even include the Mission to the Unknown prequel episode, making it 13. This story could have been a 10 out of 10 every week and it still would have dragged, but the Daleks' master plan's 3-month streak, as it is a bit shaky, and the less said about Feast of Stephen the better.
But a strange man kept telling me to take my clothes off.
Come along, we must go back to the TARDIS. This is a madhouse. It's all full of animals. Come along.
That being said, this is a wild and varied adventure where the Doctor, Stephen and Katarina stumble across a Dalek plot to destroy the universe, and along the way join forces with Nicholas Courtney as Brett Vian, Jean Marsh as Sarah Kingdom, encounter the meddling monk and come head to head with one of the biggest villains of the era, Kevin Stoney as Mavic Chen. This is easily the largest story in the history of the show, that in terms of scope, stakes and location locations visited is still unmatched. It's just way too long, with a lot of padding and running around with very little momentum. If this ever does get animated or the missing 9 episodes are found, there is an incredible 10 out of 10 abridged version of this story, a re-edit that clocks in at 2 hours just waiting to be made. But at nearly 5 hours, nah mates, just conquer the universe or get off the pot, okay?
Identify Dalek. Incorrect.
And this is where the latest Chibnall era episode lands on this ranking, and as is the case for many episodes of this era, it's not the best, but it's not the worst either. It finds itself stuck in the middle, close to greatness, but strange and dumb decisions wind up holding it back, like a slow first act with a poorly executed time skip, a prison opener which goes nowhere, and an overly complicated conspiracy plan from both the evil fascist creatures and also the Daleks. But once it gets going, it really gets going, with some incredible set pieces, wonderful iconic visuals, and I do love how Chris Chibnall characterises these Daleks as malicious, perverse aliens whose biggest strength and biggest weaknesses are their broken principles. It's a great extension of stories like Remembrance of the Daleks, and while I really wish it had taken its political themes and allegories significantly further, I think this is a solid, festive special.
The children of time are moving against us, but everything is falling into place.
While this was one of the biggest stories ever told in the history of Doctor Who, was a record-breaking finale with the most devastating companion departure yet, its place at number 11 in this list is almost exclusively down to its first part, The Stolen Earth. While the show had depicted the aftermaths of Dalek invasions, this story has the guts to put the audience through the actual thing, on a displaced Earth that is utterly helpless to fight off the threat, until the Doctor's companions band together to make the most dramatic phone call in the history of TV. The Daleks are genuinely scary here, and Julian Bleach is immense as a post-Time War Davros in a story that gives him a lot to do, but doesn't drag down the Daleks and turn them into pawns to make it happen. However, with the Daleks climbing up so high, they had way further to fall, as they're eventually defeated with a few button presses and a spinning rave party. They weren't even defeated by the main cast, as the vast majority of the returning Children of Time get sidelined with nothing to do. Journey's End was full to bursting, but The Stolen Earth was incredible TV with a world-shaking cliffhanger. But I think a top 10 spot is reserved for stories where the Daleks are themselves standing out for the majority of the runtime.
I can't stop the confusion in my mind!
Full disclosure, on a story level, I can't stand the confusion in my mind either when watching Resurrection of the Daleks. It's an impregnable serial, with about 50 plot threads going in different directions, and if the Daleks had just focused on one of those plots to conquer the universe, they might have actually won. But what this story has going for it is the incredible wit and trademark pessimism of writer Eric Saward, who breathes fresh life into the Daleks and their malevolent creator Davros, now played by the incredible Terry Malloy. Yeah, the plot is an absolute mess, but while it might be grim to the point of being overly excessive, its pessimism and disregard for all of its cast makes it strangely profound. Like, this is appropriate for a Dalek story during the Fifth Doctor's final days. With a body count larger than most horror movies and strong performances at its core, Resurrection of the Daleks is a pretty unforgettable Dalek story, even though when watching it, you'll have no clue what's going on. Another Dalek story fit for the era, Resolution serves as a more satisfying Series 11 finale than the actual Series 11 finale with the Battle of After a few years of Dalek armadas and fan service, Chibnall brought the Pepper Pot back to basics by, ironically, removing this one from its pot and showing that just one Dalek on its own is still incredibly dangerous and powerful. And this reconnaissance scout is particularly malicious, attaching itself to a human's back and managing to build itself a new casing from Sheffield steel. This Dalek is a wonderfully villainous character, and that scene of it barely giving the soldiers a chance to surrender is one of the best moments of any Dalek story.
Allocated surrender period has expired. Consequence extermination!
The microwave solution is a bit dumb, and while I do admire the subplot between Ryan and his dad and how it ties into the New Year's Day theme, as well as being the best performance Tosin Cole has given on this show, it's so separate from the Dalek story that it not only feels like it's a different show, but it's a different genre. It's not as ambitious as its sequel story, Revolution of the Daleks, but it feels like the tighter and better crafted episode because it's not trying to be 50 different things at once. This is a really strong episode, and I'm glad that Jodie Whittaker did get a great Dalek story during her otherwise mixed tenure.
But did you bother to tell anyone they might be eating their own relatives?
That would have created what I believe is termed consumer resistance.
Fan consensus has this story ranked highly in the Sixth Doctor's era, and to be honest, I'm inclined to agree. And this isn't just a potential case of a good story amongst a bad bunch. Revelation of the Daleks is a fascinating and often enthralling two-parter. It's not a very good Dalek story, as they have really just become loud grunts at this point, but Eric Saywood's wonderful script compensates by giving us a much more subdued and methodical portrayal of Davros, who has basically taken over a funeral home and is holding businesses hostage by being the main supplier of food throughout the galaxy. It's fascism through a corporate monopoly, and it also plays host to some of the most entertaining duos and character partnerships of the 80s, with almost every character getting some sort of polar opposite counterpart to play off of. It's well directed by Graham Harper, its music is chilling, and while there really is no reason for Davros to lure the Doctor here and drop a statue on him with fake blood, but seriously, I've forgotten my point. What was that all about? Colin Baker also gives a fine turn as this controversial incarnation. Also, there's a scene where a Dalek is destroyed by a concentrated beam of rock and roll, and that's just wonderful.
We are the masters of Earth. We are the masters of Earth.
We go from the wonderful to the grim, as this story was way darker than I remembered it being before my rewatch. The story opens with a brainwashed Robo-Man committing suicide by walking into the Thames in post-apocalyptic London, as a sign reading that it's forbidden to dump bodies in the river is hung in the background, and honestly, it just gets darker from there. This is a bleak six-parter that cemented the Daleks' legacy on 1960s television and proved that Terry Nation and his creations were not just a fluke. Now, the Daleks' plan in and of itself is total nonsense. The Black Dalek Slither creature is unfortunate, but we do get stunning shots of the Daleks doing Nazi-style salutes in the streets of London and stood in front of landmarks and monuments, a testament to just how large their place in pop culture was at that time for Doctor Who's very first on-location shoots. I do think the Peter Cushing movie is paced better and the action and effects are understandably better executed, but this is a really solid watch and caps off with the first ever companion departure, and still to this day, it's one of the best and most heart-wrenching.
The only interest we have in the Thals is their total extermination.
Nope, nostalgia does not play a role here. The original The Daleks story from 1963 is still a terrific, moody, and often unsettling watch. This was obviously before the Daleks could just coast along on name recognition from audiences, so it is fascinating to see them really excel and stand on their own as threatening and unhinged villains, a parallel of the Nazis and the far right less than 20 years after the end of the Second World War. This was still fresh. Their introductory cliffhanger is great, their interplay with our four-person TARDIS team is fascinating to see unfold, and while the Thals are a bit generic, and the sneaking back into the city through the caves is laborious and brings the pacing to a screeching halt, this is one of the best black and white era stories. It really does stand the test of time. I honestly don't have much more to say about it, other than it, just being a bit long at 7 parts, but if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend doing so. These bins didn't start a whole cultural movement on their own, Their first story was brilliant.
This senseless, evil killing.
My darling! Me, the Doctor! What's the matter? Don't you recognize your mortal enemy?
Doctor Who's 25th season opened with a bang. Quite literally. Even to this day, Remembrance of the Daleks stands as one of the most deliriously entertaining and action-packed stories in the show's history, and this was during a time when public support for the show was waning and its budget was at an all-time low. But it doesn't just stop there, as Ben Aronovich's brilliant script gives this story an appropriate amount of reverence for not only the show's past, but also its untold future, with this being the beginning of the ill-fated Cartmel Master Plan. It's an appropriate start to the plan as well, as this really was when Sylvester McCoy found his groove and hit his stride, in no small part due to being paired with the explosive personality of Ace, played by the iconic Sophie Aldred. Whilst prior companions ran and hid from the Daleks, she charges into the fight. Its portrayal of Davros feels like a slight regression of the character, but this story has a very thoughtful and intelligent insight into the 1960s racism due to shifting cultural trends, and how, in this case, the Daleks weren't the only fascists to worry about on the streets of London. Timely, powerful, and incredibly entertaining. If for some reason you have watched zero classic era stories, this is one of the best and most accessible jumping on points, and one of, if not the best, story of the 1980s.
Ashes to ashes. Dust to dust.
You would make a good Dalek.
We go from the Daleks' last appearance in the 20th century to their debut in the 21st. Not only did the Daleks find themselves in a new era of television, but they found themselves responding to a culture that mocked them, that thought they couldn't climb stairs and just shouted at you down a corridor. Russell T Davies and Rob Shearman decided to take that perception and use it against its old and new audience by taking a single Dalek, a survivor of the Time War, and giving it a massive upgrade. It can fly, swivel its midsection, withstand bullets, and that plunger is now a deadly tool.
What you gonna do? Sucker me to death?
But it also gave the Dalek a conscience through the touch of Rose Tyler, and while it ponders its actions and thought process that's inherent to its mutant biology, the Dalek can't stand the compromise, and would rather destroy itself than become something new and something better. Oh yeah, and it's also one of the most well-directed episodes of the show, with one of Christopher Eccleston's most fiercely powerful and intimidating performances as he charges headlong into the survivor's guilt that he's barely even managed to comprehend yet, as the wounds are still so raw. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I can't wait for the upcoming Target novelization.
Why do human beings kill human beings?
While writer Terry Nation created the Daleks and ensured their longevity in the program, I do think a great debt is owed to writer David Whittaker, who managed to evolve them as villains and characters in their own right, as this debut story for Patrick Troughton wisely pitted this brand new Doctor against a familiar foe. I mean, if the Daleks acknowledge this guy as their mortal enemy, the Doctor, then the audiences can too, right? Instead of trying to conquer the universe, the Daleks are disarmed and forced to be covert, as a small group of them are reactivated after being found in a capsule on the planet Vulcan. They manage to abuse the power struggle taking place in the colony and manipulate the team against one another. All the while, the Doctor, Ben, and Polly are desperately trying to convince them that the threat of the Daleks is real, and when they arrive in a terrifying finale. It's a 6-part story, but it flies by. The Daleks are smartly written, Troughton is magnetic, and it's filled with some of the show's best cliffhangers. It's a shame the story is missing, but the animated recreation does it justice.
We are not ready yet to teach these human beings the law of the Daleks.
Hello, the Doctor, the Great Exterminator!
I honestly debated a lot as to whether or not I should swap this and Power of the Daleks around, and whether or not that story, as opposed to The Parting of the Ways, is the better Dalek story. The Parting of the Ways is a story with immeasurable sentimental value to me, but the Daleks are more interesting villains in The Power of the Daleks, so what do? Well, I thought it was worth looking at it from another perspective, how the Daleks are the exact opposite of the Doctor, and the best stories are the ones that bring the best out of the renegade Time Lord, and in that respect, The Parting of the Ways edges out with the silver medal, with an emotionally gripping 2-part finale, which culminates with the Doctor putting his hands on another big red button to wipe out the Daleks and another race, but after everything he's been through over the past series, he can't bring himself to do it again. I've talked about this story to death, but its reputation is more than earned. It's genuinely scary, hilarious when appropriate. I love the cast. The Emperor Dalek does more than just stand in a room yelling, unlike his 1960s counterpart, and I can't think of a more fitting final battle for the 9th Doctor to have had. Fantastic.
Do I have the right?
Yes, I know, it's a cliche, but like I said in my last list video, I don't believe in contrarianism for the sake of it. Some stories have a reputation for a reason, and there's a reason that Genesis of the Daleks is the monolith that it is. It casts a massive shadow, but it walks the walk with an incredibly somber story about a civilization desperate and surviving, hiding in a bunker, being forced by the worst amongst them to become the embodiment of hatred, led by their tyrannical chief scientist Davros, played by the unmatched Michael Wisher, who is able to walk the unimaginably thin tightrope of being both subdued and terrifying and loud and ranting, without it being a parody. Nyder, Garman, Ronson, all of the cast are memorable, but it's important that we get to know this broken civilization and the boy soldiers who lead it, desperate to prove themselves. This story was broadcast in 1975, but it is still incredibly timely and relevant. After the world has recently been suitably reminded just how easy a democracy could succumb to outright fascism without the correct institutions in place, Genesis of the Daleks is way smarter and more interesting and complex than it has any right to be, especially for a family show and a story this early in Tom Baker's era, but already his moral fibre is being extensively challenged. While some episodes do drag around the middle, its atmospheric Seventh Seal opening to its nail-biting conclusion are peak Doctor Who, and it is, without question, the best Doctor Who Dalek story. Hey folks, thanks so much for watching this ranking video. Obviously, I want to know what you folks thought of it in the comment section below, as well as what your rankings are, but I also want to know what you thought of the faster, shorter format. It was necessary because I was talking about 25 stories, but I want to know whether you liked it or not, and if you want me to apply it to future videos. Also, I want to give a massive shout out to my patrons who help to keep the lights on here, and if you'd like to get involved in future projects, get your name in the credits, access to a Discord server, early access and more, then please consider becoming one. I'd like to give a particular shout out to these patrons: Matthew Perry, Anne Neubauer, James Raby, Dean Jones, Daniel Davis, Flarbu, Dylan Whitaker, Andrew Blewett, Raven Woods, Rebecca Hill, Callum Baird, The Brit Sniper, Joseph Adams, Palex, Katie Maxwell, Luna Day, Shazeb Mangi, Zachary Taylor aka Mario Fanboy 15, Thariz, Samuel Brooks, Darius, Zarby555, Nathaniel Holden, and Dan Morrison. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Trilby Reviews. I also co-host the Monster Monday horror film podcast with my fiance, and I've also started doing written film reviews again on my website, trilby.com. So lots to check out in the video description, but until then, I'll see you folks next time.